Book 1, A New End, Caden von Metz. Prologue. Nothing else exists. Nothing else matters. Location, Metz, Necropolian continent. Date, AE 17. For how does a man become what he is? He is shaped by his past experiences, of course. A stern man with a stern past, a jovial man with a jovial one, and so on. Some do deny this mold. Not most, though. Certainly not Caden von Metz. A mostly unhappy man with a mostly unhappy past. Excerpt from A History of the War. "You really have to learn to wait up for me," I rasped through heavy breaths as I doubled over, holding my hands on my knees. "Or you really need to learn to keep up, Metz," Solara chastised me as she bent down and gave me a playful kiss on the nose before turning away again. I closed my eyes as I tried, with little success, to steady my breathing. In the absence of sight, I inhaled the aroma of the wet earth around me, heard the rustling of the trees with their many branches and leaves behind me, felt the cold caress of the rain falling in its many sheets from the swollen light gray clouds above. For a moment, nothing else existed. Nothing else mattered. A warm hand struck the left side of my face, accompanied by a soft laugh. "You're kind of cute when you're beaten," Solara whispered as she grew closer, her soft breaths tickling my lips as I opened my eyes and attempted to respond. "Beaten?" I began to exclaim, but any further argument was stifled by a swift kiss. She had already twirled away before I had a moment to recover. I laughed to myself as she began running across the hilltop that we had climbed, leaving a path through the knee-high grass for me to follow. I sprinted after her, determined to catch her as to not be beaten twice. I slowed as I grew closer, wrapping a hand around her waist as I planted my feet. She managed to pull me a few more steps as my boots slipped on the mud and grass below, but in the end my weight overwhelmed her and I pulled her to the ground. We wrestled for position for only a few moments before we came to rest with her straddling my waist and raining down half-hearted hammer fists on my chest. "All right!" I exclaimed through my laughter and poorly executed blocks. "You win! You win!" "I always do," she smiled down at me before tapping my nose, gently with her right index finger. I made a show of attempting to bite her finger as she pulled it away, but we both knew I wouldn't catch her. She'd always been fast. She closed her eyes as she pulled away before extending her arms to the sides and sticking out her tongue to catch the rain. I stared at her from my position on the ground as though I was seeing her for the first time. Her raven black hair reaching down just past her shoulders, the curve of her divine jawline against her otherwise softer Asian features, and the outline of her petite form so easily seen beneath her soaking wet clothes. It all took my breath away. How a woman as beautiful as she was could be such a good person and somehow find something worth loving in me had always baffled me, and I supposed it always would. For a moment, nothing else existed. Nothing else mattered. We had lived a mostly peaceful existence in our small village of Metz, my family's namesake having founded the place some generations back. It was a middle of nowhere in the middle of nowhere, with little to export besides pelts. It was also very self-sufficient, however, so we had little need of trade. With a population of give or take 30 people, we had never required much from the rest of the world. Solara had been a new addition to the village, and I had been lucky enough to have hobbies in common with hers: hunting, trapping, and fighting. The third of which was something that almost every Metz that had ever lived had in common. Solara had become part of the family almost overnight. My mother loved her like her own daughter, and my 16-year-old sister adored her as she'd never had another girl in the house, save for my mother. My father respected her for her strong and courageous nature, and my 20-year-old brother had taken to her like no other non-family member we had ever known. There existed a hill, just outside of Metz, not but a few miles' hike through the thickly wooded forest. On a slightly rainy day, of which there were many, from atop the hill one could see the expanse of the forest, rolling hills in the distance, and the rain falling in its many sheets across it all. If one were particularly astute, they could even see the few trails of smoke rising from the fireplaces of Metz. It had been a favorite place of mine, and one that I hadn't shared with anyone. That day, I had decided to share it with Syl. For a moment, nothing else had existed. Nothing else had mattered. "Caden," Syl's urgent tone pulled me from my reverie. "Yes?" I asked as I turned to face her and saw where she was pointing, a questioning look across her features. One single stack of smoke rose from the direction of Metz, dominating the skyline on the horizon. My heart skipped a few beats as I considered the possibilities of what could have happened. "No," I responded to her unspoken question. "That is not normal." I felt my hand fall to the pommel of my blade as I swore I heard the clash of metal above the rustling of the trees. Sounds began to carry on the wind as the breeze turned harsh. The air carried shouts and cries like tortured souls from somewhere beyond life, and the trees began to shift and moan in harmony. "We need to get back," Syl said urgently, her hands having fallen to her own weapons. "Yes," I responded with a curt nod as we both began the wild sprint back to the village. We ran, heedless of obstacles and without thought of exhaustion. We tripped on roots and rolled to our feet, not breaking stride. Branches reached out like skeletal hands, raking our faces with their claws, but we did not slow. Miles were miles, however, and neither time nor distance yielded to urgency. We ran with the sole objective of reaching the village, and in those moments, nothing else existed. Nothing else mattered. A war had raged for as long as history remembered, quite possibly to the beginning of time, however long ago that had been. Aletheia and Inara, two great powers that owned all that existed. Two names that had meant very little to me until that night. Mighty powers fighting over mighty empires, augmented with Elysian soldiery, men and women that were said to be ageless, fighting with supernatural speed and strength, legends of Elysians that had died returning to life. I hadn't cared. All that mattered to me was my family, my village, and now Solara. The war had found us, however, and on that night, Inara was all that existed and all that would matter. We had found my father first, sinking into a pool of his own blood. His hand still clung to the sword even in death, the 15 bodies around him attesting to a final fight that he could not have won. The creatures he had killed were beyond recognition of the men and women they had once been, and it was then that we knew that it was the Inarans we faced. After all, they fought with the use of the undead as their main infantry, unskilled, but plentiful. I refused to take a moment from my grief as I threw myself past the threshold of our home's broken-down door. My brother, dead in the central room, sightless eyes staring at the ceiling as though he could see the clouds beyond. Bodies surrounded him as well. "Mother!" I shouted into the now quiet home. I was met with only silence. "Cade," Solara whispered urgently as she tapped her ear and pointed to the room that my mother and father had shared. I stopped, and I heard it too. A vague noise barely forced itself through the wooden door that separated the bedroom from us. It sounded like something struggling to breathe through a mouthful of mud, or like a dog with a flat nose trying to draw breath through its excitement. I knew that discretion was the better part of valor, but I didn't care as I ran to the door and slammed through its shoulder first, sword held wardingly in front of me as I entered the room, and promptly backed out of it, almost dropping my weapon in the process. My mother lay stripped and tied to the posts of the bed, covered in many small wounds, but with a knife buried in her stomach. One of the Inaran creatures was beside the bed, feasting its way through her right leg, slobbering and snarling as it gnawed on her femur. I took a moment to recenter myself, detaching myself from the motion of what I saw. The body on the bed was just a thing, a fact of life that had to be accepted and then ignored while there was still business to attend to. I tapped my sword against the frame of the door, drawing the creature's attention. It looked to me angrily for having interrupted its feast and stood. It jumped across the bed as it roared, arms extended out towards me. With a sidestep and a semicircular swing of my sword, I robbed the creature of both hands. Didn't react to the pain, however, and simply turned to continue its attack. The creature's lunge was clumsy, poorly executed, left its neck entirely too exposed. A quick swing later, a headless corpse tumbled to the ground, this time never to rise again. Solara attempted to brush past me and into the room, but I put out my arm to stop her, pushing her back as she resisted, albeit feebly, for a moment. "Don't," I said with finality as she turned to make eye contact. "There's nothing left for us here. We need to find our sister." She looked as though she would argue for a moment. Something changed her mind when she met my eyes. "Where would she go if not here?" Solara asked as I briefly wondered the same. The realization hit us both swiftly, though. With nothing more than brief eye contact and a nod, we pushed our way out of the house and towards the church. We burst from the building I had called my home and into the streets, strewn with the bodies of the undead and villagers alike. I glanced at the faces of the female dead as we ran, hoping that I wouldn't see my sister. The flames crackled and hissed in the increasing rain, but refused to be extinguished as they devoured buildings, spreading ever more embers into the wind. The church loomed ahead, a large stone building, mostly immune to the flames. As we approached, I heard nothing but silence within, which did little to comfort me. We mounted the steps quickly, and I reached for the large wooden handle that would lead within, but I hesitated as my fingers brushed against the entrance. Part of me feared what I would find within, yet the rest of me knew that I would have to face the knowledge eventually. "I'll go first," Solara offered as she reached past my hand. "No," I interrupted, knowing that, however unfortunately, what lay beyond the threshold was my responsibility first. The doors yielded to my entrance slowly, as they had so many Sundays previous, and revealed a nightmare beyond. Whatever had remained of our village had died here. The sheer number of bodies left no room to deny that simple fact. And there, on the ground, not 30 steps away, nearest the pulpit, lay the broken body of my sister. Between me and her remained 7 of the creatures who all turned to react to our entry. They attacked, and I dispassionately cut through them, hardly noticing their passing at all. The entire fight was over before I took the time to notice it. Had I been injured? I didn't know. I didn't care as I fell to my knees in front of the body. I reached out a hand but hesitated before my fingers brushed her cheek, as though the touch of cold flesh against mine would force reality to take shape. This wasn't her. She wasn't gone. I could tell myself all these things. Not if I touched her, though. Not if I brushed the matted, bloodied hair from her eyes. Not if I embraced her and she did not hold me in return. I knew I could not rest in this purgatory of uncertainty forever, though. So with breath to steel myself, I brushed aside her hair, and her vacant eyes stared past me. A breath, almost like a gasp, partly a cry, escaped my lips as I reached forward and took her in my arms, her frail body limp as I pulled her close. No, not you. God, take me, but not you," I cried to no one as I rocked back and forth, as I had rocked her to sleep so many times when we were younger. "No." The word forced its way from me, broken, mostly intelligible. I could have been there for minutes or hours before a hand rested softly on my shoulder, and I turned to see Syl through my tear-strewn gaze. She too was crying, ineffectually attempting to hold back sobs as I pulled her into my embrace. There the 3 of us sat for some time. Fire blazed around us, crackling and snapping in unison with peals of thunder that followed the lightning that arced through the night. Metz was gone. My family was dead. Solara and I only had each other now. Nothing else existed. Nothing else mattered. The Yanaran creatures never hunted alone. With the creatures came foot soldiers, possibly legions. I had never fought in a legion before, but I looked forward to the opportunity to kill one. With my family gone, the village burned. There was nothing left to do but seek revenge. After that was done, well, I hadn't thought that far into the future. We tracked them for over a day and all through the next night before we finally found their overnight encampment. 6 soldiers, one of which was clearly an officer. It was more than I'd ever fought alone, but, of course, I wasn't alone. Not this time. The first 2 died before they knew they were under attack. The others, however, reacted quickly, drawing weapons as they fell back to their officer. The 3 remaining soldiers wore black uniforms, armored with sections of hardened leather dyed a deep red like the color of drying blood. None of them wore anything more sturdy than a half-helm, and bore only standard arming swords, a mid-length blade, for weapons. The officer, however, was much better armed and armored. He was coated in mail and plate armor, the same dark red as his companions, but with a similar but red-accented uniform beneath. His full helm covered his face entirely, the mail hood showing from the slight openings. Solara and I approached cautiously at first, our movements specifically meant to cover each other's flanks. "Survivors?" the officer asked in an accent that I didn't recognize. "Hardly," I responded through gritted teeth. I wasn't in the mood for conversation. I wanted blood. "I will give you this one chance, eh? Throw down your weapons, leave this place, and we will forget we ever saw you. I can be, as you say, a generous man." "No," I responded coolly and evenly, bringing my 2-handed blade into a defensive position while Solara took her place on my right. "Very well, we will fight. Let us see if you survive my men," he said as he tapped the 3 soldiers in quick succession and ushered them forward. Where I relied on a combination of speed and strength with my longsword, Solara used only her speed with a sword and dagger pair. The 3 approached step by step, fanning to the left and right as to try and open up opportunities to strike at our flanks. The strategy was a solid one, but we had trained against such odds and such techniques. As such, we were more than prepared. As soon as the enemy had closed to a suitable distance, I took a half-fainted step in the direction of the man to my left. He responded as I hoped he would with an overhand cut. I lifted my blade above my head with the tip pointed to the ground, and allowed his sword to slide down my blade and towards the mud. I then released my right hand and performed a wild left-handed swing as I spun around. Solara had, in the meantime, reversed the grip on her dagger in her left hand and taken a step forward with her right foot. She ducked under my swing, which she had known was coming, as our opponent stepped back and out of range of the slash. She spun on her right foot as she closed the range on the enemy in the center, and brought her dagger stabbing straight into the woman's neck, deflecting the responding swing from the man to her right with her still free sword arm. The Yanaran woman fell from Solara's dagger, grasping at her throat as she tumbled, attempting to stem the flow of blood, but to no avail. I stopped paying attention to Solara's fight as the man to my left had recovered from his earlier backpedal away from my initial swing. He attempted another overhand cut, which I parried towards the ground once again before jamming the pommel of my sword into the man's exposed face. Bones cracked, blood splattered from the man's nose and mouth as he fell backward with a surprised and pained yelp. I brought my blade around into an overhand slash that ended with the sword buried in his guts. I ripped the weapon free, allowing the man his slow demise as I turned to see Solara hamstringing her opponent from where she twisted behind him. As he fell to his knees, she swiped her sword across his upper spine, paralyzing, but not yet killing him. We both fell back in step with each other as we faced the officer again. He raised his shield in acknowledgement as he drew his own arming sword. "I see that we are done with words," he called out as he fell into a defensive stance. "Come on then, let us fight." I roared as I charged the man. I was completely amazed when he sidestepped my attack and sent his armored elbow crashing into my jaw. The blow sent my world spinning as I fell uselessly into the mud. He had been so impossibly fast. I pushed myself up from the wet earth, covered in mud, as my jaw screamed in agony. I turned to find Solara's blades clashed against the man's sword and shield as he delivered a devastating headbutt with his helm that sent Solara straight into the ground as she dropped her weapons. I had found my feet as I watched the scene unfold and went to attack the man, only to have his blade pass mere inches from my neck as I threw my head back, more out of instinct than any reaction to his movements. He knew my movements before I had time to even enact them, so I decided to do something unexpected. Instead of taking another step back to regain my footing and perhaps to find my sword, I ducked inside his range and tackled him to the ground. He dropped his sword as he fell, but brought his shield around to crash into the side of my head. I heard the hollow toll of his shield as I fell, blinded to the ground on top of his sword arm. He rolled on top of me, straddling my hips as he raised his shield above his head and prepared to bring the pointed bottom down into my neck or chest. Solara came flashing out of nowhere in a headlong tackle that knocked the shield from his hands as he fell onto his back. She tumbled over and off of him into the tall grass as I lunged forward, determined to keep the man on the ground as I dove on top of him and trapped his arms with my own. Even with the position of leverage on top of him, I felt myself being forced off by his overwhelming strength. I screamed as I pushed down with every bit of strength I had left as Solara appeared, ripping off the man's helmet and exposing a face gritting with effort below. Solara jabbed 2 fingers into each of his eyes, earning a scream as the strength went from his arms. He bucked beneath me as she held her grip, and I released his arms to bring a fist crashing into his neck. I felt the windpipe collapse beneath the blow, and his screams became panicked wheezes. We both tumbled away from him quickly, and I allowed him his final thrashings from a safe distance. I collapsed to the mud and grass as the pain in my jaw and head overtook my other senses. Solara fell dizzily, almost on top of me as she held her head. We'd gotten our revenge, and as we lay there groaning in pain, shivering from the cold, nothing else existed. Nothing else mattered. I awoke beneath a coarse blanket, soft skin intertwined with mine. Normally, the unfamiliar setting would have sent me bolt upright, but my newfound apathy for life left me with little urgency. I opened my eyes to see Syl asleep beside me, nestled against the crook of my arm, a soft smile on her lips. Her dreams must have been of a better place. "Oi, I say you finally decided to open those pretty blue eyes, have you?" A male voice with an annoyingly upbeat accent asked me through the fog of my lingering sleep. I looked over and past Solara to see an armored man sitting in a stool. His armor was all blues and grays, marking him as a Lathian. He wore his long hair back in a loose ponytail and had a few days' worth of thin stubble covering his soft but handsome features. His eyes were a bright brown that seemed to shine from some inner jovial nature, and I really wanted to punch him. "And you are?" I asked groggily as I tried to focus. "Fears de Laughlin at your service," he said with a grin and a nod. "And what might I be calling you, friend?" "Caden von Metz," I answered. "Laughlin, I don't think I've ever heard of it." "He wouldn't have," he answered, a shadow passing over his face for a moment. "Went the way of Metz some time back, I'm afraid. Seems you and I have a bit in common. Aside from my dashing good looks, that is." "I don't need the looks," I grunted with a nod towards Solara. "Already got the girl." "Thee?" Fears exclaimed. "Thee? As in singular? Oi, mate, a man needs more than just the one. No offense to her damn fine self." "Maybe we don't have so much in common as you think," I answered as I attempted to rise, but a wave of dizziness sent me back to the pillow. "Oh well, maybe not," Fears answered. "Either way, I'm to go get the commander now. Althus wants a word with you." "About what?" I asked as the world slowly stopped spinning and Fears made his way to the tent flap. "Purpose," Fears answered softly. "A thing which the two of you seem to be sorely lacking." I closed my eyes, content to let him have the last word. A deep emptiness began to overwhelm me, threatening to drown me in its depths before Solara pulled herself closer to me and whispered through her sleep. "It's okay. We have each other. Nothing else exists. Nothing else matters."